We'll begin very shortly. So good afternoon from a rather cold London, and welcome to today's webinar. But I know we have people joining from all around the world, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from today. And welcome to today's webinar, the topic of which is getting to net zero, how international aid can drive a sustainable transition. I'm Siobhan Benita, I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world, in partnership with our knowledge partner today, that's EY. So in terms of today's topic, that of how international aid can drive the sustainable transition, overseas development assistance is intended to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries. And it's of increasing importance in helping those countries to move to net zero through the development of clean power and other sustainable infrastructure. And at a time of real constraints post the pandemic, with the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, all of these putting constraints on governments' budgets, making sure that aid money is spent effectively is a real concern, both for donor countries and the recipients. So in this webinar, we're going to cover issues such as the challenges to measuring the impact and the value of aid investments, and looking at how donor and recipient countries can work effectively together to make sure the money has the greatest impact. In a moment, I'm going to invite our fantastic panel to give some opening remarks, but there will also be an opportunity, once you've heard from our speakers, for you, the audience, to put your questions to the panel members. So whichever device you are on, you should see somewhere on your screen a Q&A function, a Q&A button. At any point from now on, please use that Q&A function to message in your questions, and we will get through as many of those as we can before the end of the webinar. So now to introduce our panel. First, we will hear from Catherine Stratos, who is Deputy Director for Climate and Cross-Sectoral Strategy at the Centre for Environment, Energy and Infrastructure in the United States Agency for International Development. Catherine joined the agency in 1991 to work on its assistance programme for Eastern Europe. And since then, she's worked on climate and development issues in various leadership positions, including serving as the Director for the agency's Global Climate Change Office. Then we will hear from Dr. Pradeep Kurukula Surya, who is Executive Coordinator of Environmental Finance at the United Nations Development Programme. Pradeep leads a team that is accountable for the provision of support and oversight of a 5.4 billion portfolio on nature, climate and energy. The portfolio is currently active in over 142 countries. Prior to joining the UNDP in 2006, Pradeep worked with the World Bank's Agriculture and Rural Development and Environment departments, and he began his career in an NGO in Sri Lanka. Then we will hear from our knowledge partner. So we'll hear from Russell Marsh, who is Associate Partner at EY Singapore. Russell is a carbon, renewable energy and sustainable finance specialist with over 20 years experience in the UK, Australia and Southeast Asia. He's currently supporting the delivery of the energy and climate components of the Australian government's Partnership for Infrastructure programme. Previously, Russell worked in various roles in the UK, focusing on carbon and renewable energy policy. And in 2014, he was the member of an expert panel appointed by the German government to review the work of the renowned Potsdam Institute of Climate Research. Then we come back here to the UK, where we hear from Nick Bridge, who is the Special Representative for Climate Change at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Nick was appointed to this position in 2017, and he's advised the last 5 foreign secretaries on climate and environmental diplomacy. Nick was previously Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the OECD and IEA, Chief Economist at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he's served for over a decade in diplomatic postings to China, Japan, and the United States. And then last but by no means least, we will hear from Franco Conzato, who is a senior expert in the Directorate for Sustainable Development Policy and Coordination at the Directorate General for International Partnerships in the European Commission, where he provides advice to the Director on Sustainable Development Policy. During his career, Franco has served as economic advisor in the EU delegations in Ghana and Ethiopia, and he represented the EU at the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, of which he was vice chair between 2008 and 2009. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we have a truly stellar, brilliant panel with us here today. Please, to the audience, do take this opportunity to message in your questions. We want to really maximize that opportunity while we have these great speakers here with us today. But without further ado, Catherine, I'm going to invite you to give us your opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Hello, I'm Catherine Stratis, and I've worked more than a decade on climate issues at the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is the U.S. government's primary development assistance agency. We're active in more than 100 countries. We program about $25 billion with 10,000 staff. We work on humanitarian, health, education, governance, biodiversity, climate, and other development endeavors. We're often co-located with the U.S. Embassy, and we work closely with the Department of State on climate issues. Next slide, please. So USAID adopted a new climate strategy in 2022. It was the result of extensive consultations within the agency and with various constituencies. And to me, this was one of the best things that we could do for ourselves to guide us and to inspire our colleagues across the agency. This slide shows the framework at the heart of the strategy. And I'll just highlight a few elements for our discussion today. So first, the vision is to advance net zero, climate resilient, and equitable development. And we in the climate community are really underscoring to our colleagues that this is a new paradigm for development that we all need to subscribe to. Second, one of our cross-cutting principles for how we do our work is locally led development. So in the climate world, I like to say locally led exists along a continuum. When it comes to international climate negotiations, focusing on a government's climate priorities as expressed in its nationally determined contribution and our national adaptation plan is a great place to start. And we in our strategy commit ourselves to doing that. Though it is our intention to partner extensively with local governments, private sector partners, and local communities too, including the marginalized and underrepresented groups within them. Third, the strategy aims, to enable us to confront both the most urgent demands of the climate crisis and to help transform systems in a way that will lock in net zero climate resilient pathways. So we hope to promote change in the many sectors in which we work. So what does that look like in real life? So some of our missions are taking steps such as getting their entire mission together to better understand how climate change impacts the country in which they're working, and to chart a response across their assistance portfolio. Another way of doing it is to integrate climate considerations into project designs and solicitations, really in any of the sectors in which we work in. And I'll just mention one example, which is based on work that we've done for years in this one particular program, but it is serving as a model for what we can do more broadly. And that's something called the Engendering Industries Program, which has helped 30 renewable energy companies hire and promote more than 4,500 women. And more than half of those companies report improved business performance, which they correlate to their efforts to increase gender equality at the workplace. So that's just a little tidbit. So next slide, please. So this strategy is not USAID's first rodeo when it comes to supporting climate action. And so we're basing the way we work, also the way we work with our Department of State partners, on past experience supporting low emissions development strategies and the first generation of INDCs. And in our experience, that effective support really requires whole of government climate policy coordination and planning on the partner government side, which enables cross-sectoral solutions to complex challenges such as deforestation, where maybe the Department of Energy should do something as well as the forestry ministry. A coordinated donor approach on the ground, preferably with the host government's active involvement, encourages division of labor, complementary assistance, and often a unified donor voice on policy recommendations. In our case, also, it's really important to coordinate within the US government, which we have learned both the hard way when that doesn't happen. Next slide, please. And then finally, I just wanted to reflect a bit on the challenge of coping with something that seems especially prevalent in our climate world, which is what some of us conceive as, ever expanding set of climate initiatives, commitments, and campaigns that can be, bewildering at times. And so I'd like to pose the question, what is the antidote to that situation? I think part of it is to stick with the tried and true, some of the things that I just described previously. And I would say, it's on one hand, we're working very hard to entice the private sector and philanthropy to get involved in climate action. And therefore, there is this tendency to create new initiatives. But ultimately, it seems, to me at least, that it's important that we stay demand driven, that we focus on those long-term systematic approaches and systems change, that we stay results oriented, and that we focus on the results and less on the start of things and the amount of money that we pledge initially. And then that we, broaden the tent and the relevance of climate work by focusing not only on our climate results, but also on the development priorities and results, such as cleaner air and water, improved health outcomes, more resilient landscapes and cities. And I was just reflecting if we can more systematically tie the climate goals to the results of the sustainable development goals and targets, and what might that look like? And I just put that out there as a question to see if others have some ideas. And then finally, on a really practical note, I just want to remind those who may be aware but have forgotten, there is the NDC partnership, which has the online Climate Finance Explorer, which helps, which can help you narrow assistance and find the fund that is the best fit. So I'll add that link at some point during our chat. So with that, I turn it back over to you, Siobhan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. A great way to start, because I think you've raised a lot of issues there that others will come back to. So things I noted there, really good to hear about the new strategy or climate aid strategy in 2022, building in that advancement to net zero and the equitable transition. So real focus on equality as well. And some of the things you said around the underrepresented groups. The real sense of dealing with the urgent, but also making sure that what you put in place is sustainable, resilient, and leads to long-term results as well. Needing a better understanding of climate impacts in countries, and then that whole of government approach, both for the donor countries and the recipients, all departments having to work together more effectively. And something I'm sure, I know at least Russell is coming back to, this sense of a bewildering number of initiatives that can be quite overwhelming for recipients in particular to understand and navigate their way through. And we will also share that link to people in the audience that you mentioned at the end. Thank you so much, Catherine. A great place for us to start. And now, Pradeep, I'm coming over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me in this panel. It's a real treat to be amongst fellow thought leaders on this topic. I want to take a step back and talk a little about the context that we're in, particularly when we want to have a conversation about how ODA can drive, help us all achieve net zero targets. I think first it's important to recognize that right now ODA is pretty stretched as it is. We have a lot of humanitarian issues that need to be dealt with. And I think we certainly are seeing a lot less investment in long-term development needs. And there is, of course, currently a need to invest in peace and prevention and on gender and of course the SDGs in general. And none of that is going to be achieved without investments in governance and alignment with, climate goals as well as nature goals and so on and so forth. There is a context in which we live in right now where trust has eroded, something that we spoke to very much in our Human Development Report. The trust that with the Global South, a lot of it needs to be rebuilt. And this really speaks to the issue of going beyond ODA finance, because I think we all recognize that the scale of the challenge that we face is not going to be addressed with ODA alone. We have to be much more deliberate in our efforts to crowd in larger streams of private finance. So getting finance right is absolutely critical, and ODA has an important role to play, but it is not where the story ends. In fact, if you think about it, there is no shortage of capital in the world today. I think there's about 300 trillion. We're talking about a global stock of about 300 trillion that's currently available. But we know that that's the current system that we're in is not channeling that finance to where it's mostly needed. Some of it is certainly going towards, renewable energy investments, let's say, in emerging markets and stable markets. But if you look at investments in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, it's abysmal, and we're not going to have the kind of change without ensuring that those sort of elephant in the room issues, so to speak, are addressed. Now, I think there are three things that come to mind, certainly in our work in UNDP, that we think is fundamental if we are to address an effective pathway to net zero. One, of course, is the whole issue of de-risking and creating an enabling environment for the kind of finance that we need to see. We know that developing countries are already allocating large amounts of precious dollars that they get from their own tax receipts into, resilience-related issues. They have no choice when they are facing sea level rise and they're facing drought and they're facing energy shortage to do that. And we've done our homework through our climate expenditure reviews in a number of developing countries that suggest that investment is quite high, but it's not enough. And government alone cannot simply through public resources, scarce public resources, address these issues. And we've been trying through our efforts such as the UNDP Climate Promise to try and help countries create that enabling environment, fully aligned with the NDCs, of course, but to ensure that the framework for attracting both domestic private finance as well as international private finance flows is strengthened, because without that, we're not going to get anywhere. And our work with national governments and ministries of finance on developing these integrated national financing frameworks have been critical to help ensure that their SDG priorities are translated into investment platforms or investment vehicles or frameworks that really can help bring in the resources that they need. And this, I think, is absolutely critical. The second, beyond de-risking, is really to figure out the type of financing instruments that are necessary to attract the kind of resources that are needed. Now, traditionally we talk about grant funding, which is great. It's needed in many of these emerging and risky market settings. That is absolutely critical. But we also need to make sure that there are instruments such as guarantees and other types of ways in which you can provide confidence to the investor community that they do need to come in. And in this context, also working with tax reform policies in countries become absolutely critical in order to raise the kind of resources that are needed. Now, we see, of course, a huge interest in debt instruments, bonds and carbon markets beginning to emerge, and those are absolutely important. But as we all know, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of integrity issues, and now the debt crisis that is having, quite a significant amount of impact on the effectiveness of those types of instruments. And thirdly, my final point is really, at the end of the day, logic alone is not enough here. We have so many biases and beliefs that consciously or subconsciously influence decision making. And unless we are going to really make the transition to where we need, or the direction in which we need to head to, behavioral change becomes absolutely critical, and behavioral change at a scale that I don't think we've ever seen before, and perhaps a glimpse of which we got was when we all changed our behavior globally in the aftermath of COVID. I think we need to see something at that kind of scale, which fully recognizes the need for us to consciously move towards net zero. And I don't think that is where we are today. So a lot of work ahead that we need to do. Over to you, Shobhan.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Pradeep. I'm really interested in bringing in a different kind of perspective there. So as you say, in that context of ODA being stretched already, the sense that kind of the public sector can't do this on its own, but what they can do then is use all the policy tools available to them to kind of create the environment and leverage as much as possible the private investment in that kind of transition to net zero in the aid space. So as you say there, the three key things you've picked out: de-risk and create the enabling environment for investment, be clear on the types of financing instruments that are going to help attract the best investment, and then that real sense of needing behavioral change on a scale that we've only seen in a crisis kind of situation, because arguably we are in a crisis situation when it comes to the climate. Thanks so much, Pradeep. Again, lots of food for thought there. And I can see we've already got some questions coming in. So to the audience, please do keep them coming in. Russell, I'm coming over to you now.
Thanks, Siobhan, and good evening, everybody. It is good evening for me. I'm sitting here in Singapore, and it's getting close to 11 p.m. In the evening, but I'm really pleased to be able to join this session this evening. As Siobhan said in the introduction, so I'm Russell Marsh. I'm an associate partner at EY in Singapore. I've been working on climate and renewable energy policy issues for nearly 25 years now, working in the UK, Australia, and now in Singapore with a focus on ASEAN. And I'm going to sort of talk about some of the observations from working on what is now 3 international aid programs of different countries, all focused on different elements of climate change in this region. The first program was the one I've been working on for over 3 years now, which is a program of the UK government, which is the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, which is all around supporting countries in the ASEAN region to accelerate the deployment of low carbon energy, and obviously as a way to meeting their climate commitments and NDCs. I had a particular focus on climate, on green finance and energy efficiency. And so EY was the main delivery partner of that program over the last 3 years. I'm now also working on a program of the Australian government, again, an international aid program that has a focus on infrastructure broadly, but as an element of that is around the deployment of sustainable infrastructure and energy transition. And I'm also involved in a program of USAID that they run in this region, in Indonesia. Delivered a few programs through that program, again focused on the energy transition. And so kind of putting all of that together and say sort of my experience working on the delivery end of some of these programs for the last few years, sort of a few observations of things I've learned, I've picked up, and I think will be helpful in thinking about how these programs are developed and taken forward in the future. I think the first one, and it's been mentioned already, and it won't be a news to anyone, is that it's a very crowded space. There are lots of donors, both public and private, who are looking to support the energy transition, particular in this region, which is both an opportunity in terms of the amount of support that is available for countries in this region is increasing, but obviously it's a challenge in terms of how do you ensure that those programs are not tripping over each other? How do you ensure that they're delivering valuable work for the beneficiary countries, and in a way that isn't necessarily overwhelming those beneficiary countries with constant requests for inputs? So I don't necessarily have the answer. I think it's just pushing that up as a challenge. And I know certainly in the time I've been in the region that the major donors are spending more time talking to each other about what they are doing. So you can come up with pooling the money, coming up with programs that are aligned to each other and not overlapping with each other. And I think it's also worth saying it's not just, it's also, the problem is also can be caused by the beneficiary governments. I have to say, I have seen the same governments give the same scope of work to 2 or 3 different donors without the other donors knowing that. So I think it's just a question around making sure there is good collaboration between the various different donors and communication between them, so we understand what's happening. So as sort of leading the UK program, a large part of my job was spent talking to the other delivery partners, the other donors, to understand what they were doing to make sure that our program was relevant and was adding value to what else was going on around the region. I think the second thing, and this is where again thinking about how is that support delivered, what are the kind of things that programs can focus on. It's very clear, and again, what I'm about to say won't be rocket science, because the net zero debate is moving very quickly. It's not quite like this, but almost a new initiative around net zero comes up every week. It did feel like that in the run up to COP26. But obviously trying to keep up with all of those, particularly in some of the countries in this region where the government departments who are responsible for some of these are quite small. So trying to keep up with all the different initiatives and understand the differences between them can be quite difficult. I mean, I reflect on when we started working on the UK program, so which had a focus on green finance. Pretty much all people talked about at that point certainly in this region was around green bonds. When he talked about green finance, everyone just talked about green bonds. And I now have a slide I present that has something like 12 or 13 different types of bonds that are all aimed at different elements of sustainability. That's sort of green bonds, social bonds, moving through now to to the sustainability linked finance that exists, and just helping. We spend a lot of time through our program helping governments and other stakeholders just understand what all these different initiatives meant, and what they should do in terms of which ones should they focus on, and how they should engage with those initiatives, and particularly when it came to how you could use things like the bond market to get private finance into projects. What is the process for doing that? And again, a green bond is quite different to a sustainability linked bond, and so helping them understand what those differences are and then how they can use those has been quite a large part of what the program's done. And in my view, I think that's going to continue. I don't think things are going to slow down. Again, I'm reflecting on when I started the UK program in 2019, people were just starting to talk about TCFD. Now the market is just about beginning to understand what TCFD is, and they're being asked to look at TNFD. So I think these things are moving quite quickly. And that means there was always going to be this need for the kind of support that the programs that I'm working on and other donors are provided, which is around providing that information and knowledge, so that the countries, governments, and the stakeholders can understand all these different initiatives are. I think the final one is also around what's particularly interesting in this region is a lot of focus on social. So a lot of governments more interested in how they could get finance for social infrastructure as opposed to just green infrastructure. So that was both a challenge in terms of, again, how do you shape a program that has a primarily climate focus that's looking but we're being asked to support social infrastructure. But there's also an opportunity in terms of how you can actually bring those two elements together in terms of how do you develop social infrastructure that is also a low carbon infrastructure. I think that just goes back to, again, points that have been made earlier around, making sure you know what the recipient government or what the beneficiaries are looking for, so you can make sure that you are able to design the program to best meet their needs. And I think the final question, again, a comment I would make, and say it goes back to things I've just said earlier, is, interestingly, the two most common questions I've been asked, and we've now, I've been working on the programs out here sort of for 3 or 4 years now, is firstly is, how do I access all this finance that you tell me is available? And the second one is, mostly coming from corporates, is how on earth do they start down the journey of the energy transition? I think that just highlights, again, the need for ongoing support from, say, a number of the programs that have been mentioned here, in terms of really helping this region in particular, say the ASEAN region, understand what all these initiatives are, the fact that there is money and finance available to support a lot of projects out here, how they can get access to that, and helping them, work their way through what can seem to be quite a complex mix of different initiatives and projects and programs that are out there, and how do sort of countries who are just starting start, what should they focus on? And within those organizations, how do the corporates in that country also start in terms of what are the things they should focus on, given that massive mix of different initiatives and programs that they could look to engage with.
Thanks, Russell.
That's probably all I say now. So hand back to Siobhan, and happy to answer some questions later on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Russell. So again, another point, picking up on what Catherine kind of alluded to at the start, but as you've said there, a couple of real challenges in particular for recipient countries, just the sheer number of kind of donors and investors that are there in the region that you've got the most experience of, kind of Southeast Asian region. How do you get the donors to be working more effectively together? How do you avoid overlap? How do you avoid duplication? But also just the initiatives moving very fast and evolving very fast. It's quite hard for some of the smaller countries in particular to keep up and navigate that landscape and to understand which of those initiatives might be best suited for them. So a lot more work that donors could be doing in helping to support, I think, those kind of potential recipient countries in understanding all of those areas. Thank you so much, Russell. Nick, we're coming over to you now.
Thank you very much. And I thought I would first thank you very much to the organisers for this and for everyone who's taken the time to join us. I thought rather than sort of read a script, I'll first just bounce off what colleagues have said so far. There was a lot in Catherine's description of US aid policy that feels very familiar from the UK's own revision of our development strategy last year as well. So the 4 headlines for us were driving investment in all countries and finding out ways to do that more effectively in a more clean way. Women and girls, still a very strong emphasis there. Third, as Pradeep alluded to, a huge humanitarian focus. And finally, climate linked together importantly with nature and health. And so those big global drivers. But then, as Catherine said, sort of the cross-cutting themes, the equity themes running through. So a lot of common thinking, I think, across the DAC members. The thing I took particularly, Pradeep spoke along lines which I entirely agreed with, and had so much of what I was going to say he has already said so well, so I don't need to, but I was particularly struck. I was going to draw out also the emphasis on seeing our constrained public sector aid budgets within this extraordinary, enormous but complex financial system of private sector finance, of blended finance, of the roles of the multinational development banks and the regional development banks, and philanthropists, and so on. So this vast space that we've entered into in terms of aligning and working together to leverage huge amounts of finance, and the fact it's not going into the places it needs to go into. There is massive surges in areas like humanitarian, partly due to climate and nature induced tragedies, which are going to escalate more and more, but also, you know, as countries compete for green investments, green deals. We've seen the IRA and we've seen the Green Deal in Europe, and we need to ensure that countries across Africa and Asia are also being supported to have the enabling conditions to attract all of that finance. So I really resonated what Pradeep was saying about where public aid sits within the wider financing position. And then Russell has just very much struck me as well, the need now in a very complex, multi-dimensional set of goals. A lot has come along, a lot has been committed to, and I'll come on to COP26 and our responsibility for many of those commitments. But now a general direction of travel indicated, to which everyone is signed up, but the big businesses are all saying, but what's the standard? What's the regulatory framework that's consistent? What's the tax framework? How do we all get to net zero in the most effective way? What's the access to the money on the side of developing partners? And just a complexity to all of that we're only just beginning to work through. And I'll sort of jump off at that point and just then build up a couple of points of my own. One is just off that point that Russell made. You know, it was absolutely critical for us, having come out fairly recently from the COP26 presidency. You know, don't forget that in 2019, when the UK upgraded our Climate Change Act through secondary legislation to net zero, that was the first major economy to do net zero legislation just 3 or 4 years ago. A couple of very leading smaller countries had done so, but that was the first big economy to do it just back in 2019. And when we took on the COP presidency, less than a third of the world had any kind of commitment to net zero. So by the end of the presidency, we had 90% of the world committed to net zero. But that is an absolutely seismic shift in the way the global economy is going to have to run, and also a political recognition of it. And that's only just 2 or 3 years ago, at a time when we don't have time to not act faster at scale and in all aspects of our economy. So I'm just sort of sharing, I suppose, that sense that we had in the COP26 period of actually absolutely needing to get those targets in place, because we didn't have widespread lock-in of the Paris commitment and a genuine net zero commitment at the political level, which is so essential. And that was very important for then unleashing more ambition in the nearer term, in the 2030 NDCs, which needed to be so dramatically raised. We did a good job there of raising a lot of 2030 targets and bringing down the trajectory that temperature increases were on, but still a long way to go. But you have to set that long-term goal with a net zero goal, and then countries have to go away and work out what that means for 2040, 2030, 2025, 2023. And it means just an extraordinary shift for everybody. And those plans take time. We had, close to net zero legislation in 2008 in the UK. And so we've had a big advance on many countries in terms of trying to work this through our own domestic economy. And it's so tough. We've done really well on energy and decarbonising our energy system. But, like many others, transport, agriculture, land use, energy efficiency, industry is really tough and ongoing. So I suppose I'm just describing, just what a febrile space this is. There's so much changing. There's so much happening. That there's an urgency, but there's also a need to get that to get action right. We just have sort of time to really have one shot at aligning the financial system, aligning governments in country, and aligning new investment flows. So one thing that's absolutely got to be the case in our aid is the Paris alignment and the Glasgow alignment. Everything's got to be aligned with that goal, and clean and green, and all the co-benefits of that are so extraordinary. We all know, but that's a process. We have to really keep working with the multilateral development banks to ensure that all of their efforts are also aligned in that sense. Just as I mentioned that net zero has come along relatively recently, finally, our alignment of the sort of nature and climate goals and many of the wider SDGs has only really just begun to click. And I was very pleased to see the outcomes at the Convention on Biological Diversity at COP15 on the back of COP26, where we're talking in the same breath and in an integrated way more than ever before about climate and nature and environment and ecosystems. And that's a huge new big shift as well. So I think I mentioned some of the ways that at COP26 we made some progress in these areas. We put a big emphasis on finance. We put a big emphasis on net zero, on new NDCs. We were way off track on delivering the 100 billion goal by 2020, as Pradeep mentioned. We weren't even delivering on our previous promises. We managed to get a lot of doubling of aid commitments out of countries. We also got some tripling of nature commitments out of countries. We got the 100 billion goal back on track, but late and delayed. That's really been a challenge for trust from all countries. Coming to the 100 billion 2 or 3 years late is not good, as we start to try and set the right tone for working out what the post-2025 financing frameworks need to look like. But we just need to get on, deliver that 100 billion, and then look very ambitiously at the next phase. On top of that, we have the loss and damage agreement at COP27, which was so important. And so we now need to work out how to deal with that. And it's only really coming to dawn on people just how destabilized our ecosystems, our Earth systems are already, and how that will play out in terms of the impact on every country's resilience and its adaptation. So coming finally, Siobhan, just to sort of what that means for our development policy, it really does throw all the cards up in the air. I mean, the development goal has to be absolutely integrated with the climate nature imperatives and has to be fully clean and resilient development. And that's sort of, in a way, that is every country's entire national development strategy, national planning strategy. And you need to break that down into different sectors, into different areas for every country, and work out how to support the drive, support the finance, support the investment. This really is a period to be having this conversation. It really, everything is being opened up and needs to be taken forward rapidly. A few examples, I think, what's working quite well. You've got 30
seconds, Nick, before we
Franco. The just energy transition partnerships, I think, were a really great step in recent months between countries to really drive an energy transition. Climate finance accelerators are happening around the world, where we're bringing together and making a market for big financing, a big clean infrastructure projects. A big new stress on commitments to nature investments and nature-based solutions. And I think really now a bigger political understanding of the way that adaptation and resilience needs to be at the heart of our development strategies. So, number one, political leadership to keep this top of the agenda. Number two, a much greater recognition of how much we are dependent on each other as international partners to collaborate and to recognize that the only way forward is greater cooperation. And number three, that driving development, a clean, sustainable development with our climate goals in a more integrated way, and bringing all sources of finance on board rapidly is what we need to see. Thanks, Siobhan.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. I mean, you've summarized it yourself there really well, but just really interesting to reflect on what you said there on kind of the COP26 presidency and how quickly things have changed from kind of 2019, as you say, the UK being the first major economy to have net zero legislation, to 90% of the world's economy then by the end of kind of that COP having signed up. Massive shift there. And then echoing what some of the other speakers have said about the importance of getting that the kind of ecosystem of finance and blended finance, private investment right, how the public can do the most it can to leverage some of that. And then also, because we've had questions on this, that importance of aligning the climate goals with other goals around biodiversity and nature. So we'll come back to some of that in the questions, because Catherine raised those at the beginning. Thank you so much, Nick. And then, as I said before, last but by no means least, Franco, we're coming over to you before we go to all the audience questions.
Thank you, Siobhan. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone from Brussels. And thank you for inviting the Commission to discuss such a key topics. In 2019, the EU presented the European Green Deal that was already mentioned, a plan to ensure net emission of greenhouse gases by 2050, and what I think is particularly interesting for us, to decouple the economic growth from resource use. This was what we call an internal policy, but it has an important external dimension. That's why we come straight into the topic. And and you know, the EU with the member states are the largest provider of climate finance in the world. So I was very interested to hear from the other panelists that we are getting into quite a complex exercise. In 21 alone, the EU with the European Investment Bank, we put more than 5 billion towards climate action. And altogether with the 27 member states, we are now around 23 billion in terms of climate finance. In 2021, we launched the Global Gateway Strategy, which is for us, let's say, a way to provide a real framework for the EU external action to address these challenges, and outlining the what could be the EU offer to narrowing the global investment gap, and accompany, you know, the twin green and digital transition beyond the European borders. So Global Gateway covers both hard infrastructure and connectivity, and the enabling environment was already mentioned, so all the regulatory parts. And at the core, the ambition is to present a transformative, large-scale projects that combine public and private financing for investment. As I guess Pradip pointed out, you know, aid alone cannot do it. So the important role for ODA is really to be a catalytic factor. So Global Gateway, our commitment is that to mobilize up to 300 billion in investment in global infrastructure, and half of it in Africa. Again, I'm grateful to Pradip, who bring back the issue of sub-Saharan and African in general, in terms as what could be really the focus of this action. And EU institution, member states, European financial institution, private sector, we are really trying to bring them together and see if we are able to leverage this investment. That's what we call the Team Euro approach. Nick mentioned this initiative on climate change adaptation and resilience in Africa. This is one of the, you know, the tests for the EU to see if the Team Europe works, which is already in a way for the EU to show that we could be the problem, because we have the highest number of donors and provider of development funds in countries, and see if we are able to limit this by bringing all this group together and try really to be a bit more to have a much bigger impact. So you see the slide there. You know, that's the idea was to give you a kind of snapshot on what the Global Gateway means. So there you have a number of programs that are, some of them are almost completed. For instance, in Niger, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, and other are in the process to be concluded. The point I wanted to make is that the modality, you know, again, Pradip bring us together with Russell the way we mix this funding. So there we are mainly blending, so grants plus concessional loans. But this brings also partnership, of course, because it means that you bring actors, different actors around the table for programs that are a strong development element. And Pradip also mentioned the guarantee. At the moment, I think we are looking into the energy sector, if this can be also fly. For the moment, we have guarantee in different plans, also in, let's say, transport infrastructure. Guarantee means that the EU will guarantee the investment and try to address the point, number one point of Pradip, of de-risking and making sure that we will have at the end of the day more investment than aid. Let me just briefly mention, that we are quite optimists, perhaps overambitious. We consider that normally in energy, we will have a leverage effect of 6-7 times. So for €1 that we put in grant, we will have up to 6 to 7 euro in loans. And if we move to transmission line, we can actually double this this leverage effect. So of course there is a great expectation that the way we mix this different instrument. One thing I wanted to highlight is particularly for Africa, we don't have, and I come back with the issue of partnership. We don't have only government country involved. We have regional organizations. That's, if we want to address the issue of standards, they have to be in because there are power pool in sub-Saharan Africa. So unless you make sure that you have this work, it will be problematic to advance. So again, partnership become one of the key factors. Let me shift a little bit to something that I think was not mentioned so far. So all this imply that we all, all actors are able to rely on high quality data, and this is what I wanted to briefly bring our current experience. So we have been trying to support a number of knowledge platform. We have one for Africa, and this is basically to support common policy priorities between the EU and the African Union, but also to improve efficiency in delivering of data within Africa. This is linked to the topic of, let's say, how we can really to give a push on the issue of country-based research, and particularly to build knowledge in area of intervention that even for the donor are new. So there is a high level of innovation in what has been mentioned by the before. In technical terms, how you built up an investment package, but also in policy and political terms. To see how to show if this works or not. These are really long. We are really acting on a long time. To build up. Not to mention how long it takes to prepare one of these programs. Could easily take more time to prepare it, find the funding, then put it on the ground. That's the experience that we had in a recent research that we did. And so this knowledge is also scattered around. I'm sure that, USAID, not to mention World Bank, IMF, UN, UK, and the private as well, because we have private entity also very active in research, produce an incredible amount of knowledge that is very difficult to, let's say, converging in places where they can be used to make sure that your program can really scale up, because this is, let's say, the challenge that we are facing right now. This is scaling up. Ourselves, we are testing new tools. One is called systemic review, which is a way to look at really the whole universe of knowledge in a certain area and make sure we can put that available for everyone. So that brings me to my last point, that in this undertaking, we really need to ensure transparency, and particularly with the dissemination of these evidence products based on research, and hopefully to treat knowledge as a public good, and this to us is, with capacity building, the key to make sure that our partner in developing our development partners are really much more entrust. So with this, I'll thank you very much, and looking forward for the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Franco. So really interesting to hear what the EU is doing on this, mobilizing sort of half of the 300 billion budget that you're saying in Africa. So picking up on what other speakers have said about the need to make sure the money is going to the right place, including in Africa. A snapshot of those projects, as you said, a lot of them involving partnerships and blended finance. So again, reflecting what Pradeep and others have said about kind of using the public money to bring in private investment. And then bringing in that other point that hadn't been touched on yet, the importance of evidence and data, both for research, innovation, but also to evaluate how well the projects are going, which is really important for political decision making. Thank you so much, Franco, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for those wonderful presentations. We have lots of questions that have come in, so I'm going to go straight to questions from the audience. I'm going to pick up two first that are directed in particular to individual speakers in response to their initial remarks. So the first one was from Narendra, and that was aimed at you, Catherine, and that was saying, thank you for your wonderful presentation. We all agree with that. But Catherine, Narendra was asking, could you say a little bit more about nature-based solutions? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what these are? And I think Nick also picked up on these, so Nick can come in as well if he would like. But Catherine, what are nature-based solutions?
Sure, yeah, so nature-based solutions, that's really recognizing that we can't get to 1.5 without conserving forests and doing quite a bit of reforestation and regreening of our landscapes. So that really at AID, we have a very large biodiversity conservation program. And one of its main areas of focus is to help conserve the ecosystems in which species require to thrive. But we also see a lot of opportunities for nature-based solutions, not only for capturing carbon, but also for making landscapes and even urban areas more resilient. So you can often use green infrastructure that can be mangroves, that can be protecting upper watersheds to prevent flooding downstream in urban areas. Measures such as that can be very effective, very cost effective, and have a lot of development co-benefits that, say, a hard infrastructure solution might not have.
Right.
So that's it in a nutshell.
Brilliant, thank you. Nick, did you want to add anything to Catherine's answer there?
Well, I mentioned in my remarks just how relieved but frustrated it's taken this long to see nature and climate coming together in a more integrated way for all the reasons Catherine's just described. I mean, just to give one illustration, at the COP26, we had the biggest gathering of world leaders ever by far in our country, and we had to sort of think what that top headline was going to be on day one, and we chose to ask all of the world leaders to commit to ending deforestation and restoring forestry by 2030, because if you're looking at one thing you can do in the world that leaders and their citizens can relate to, it was that was the thing. So it's just illustrative of just how vital it is to think much more around nature's restorative powers, and that's an absolutely vast part of the climate solution that was previously not given enough attention. We were very focused rightly on cutting emissions in industry and in energy, coal and gas and oil, but we were not giving enough attention to the important role of nature in doing its job. I just also referenced in my remarks the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15, which was the sort of sister event to COP on climate. You've got the COP on biodiversity, and it was also striking that one of the major announcements in December in the Montreal Kunming Declaration was the protecting and putting aside 30% of land and 30% of oceans as an absolutely critical starting point for getting to the place we need to be so the ecosystems can continue to regulate the climate. So a lot of attention now being brought to this topic quite rightly, and it's just such a win-win, as Catherine said.
Thanks, Nick. I'm moving over, Pradeep, to a question for you from Emmanuel. It's a very large question, I think.
I've read it.
Everything.
Yeah.
So Emmanuel has asked, how can investors improve the world climate situation, notwithstanding the challenges the developing world faces? Are there economic factors that investors have control of that may help make a huge impact on the challenge of climate change. So how can investors help, I think, is the question.
Right. Well, I mean, Emmanuel, I think, the first thing I would say is that at the end of the day, while we may look at it from the prism of an investor, we need to recognize that at the end of the day, it is really very much about a whole of society approach here. You do need the public sector to work alongside private investors to make it all work in the way that we want to. And that isn't always the case. So I do want to sort of start by saying that it does take more than one party here to effect the change. But having said that, I mean, I think at the end of the day, what we're also seeing is a shift in a number of sort of boardrooms and investor thesis around the world that really does recognize now the need to make this shift towards a net zero pathway, most of all, because many are afraid of being stuck with stranded assets. They do not want to be on the wrong side of history down the road. And that, of course, is something that's very much in their minds, to make sure that they do invest in the right type of technologies that do have the kind of revenue streams that stand the test of time, which in this current context is not all that obvious compared to, say, 50 years ago. It's changing. The world is changing, and we see this through the increase in disclosure requirements. We see this in sort of the underlying investment thesis of investors themselves, who are now looking for much more holistic returns, let's put it that way. So investing in R&D alongside investments in clean energy, investments in green technology, green infrastructure, shareholder activism. This is another big thing, taking hold of what a boardroom ought to be talking about, and what the type of values that shareholders themselves should be striving for. And then finally, of course, divesting away from some of the more harmful, obvious investments that we cannot really tolerate anymore. And some of it, including, investments in fossil fuels. But that, again, isn't just the investor community. I mean, we also have to understand that right now governments spend more than $400 billion today on fossil fuels. I mean, this is just ridiculous when you really think about the issues that we're facing. And we do need to transition away from that type of, expenditure patterns. So it really does require both sides of, all stakeholders here to really come together. And civil society is an absolutely integral part of that equation as well.
Thanks so much, Pradeep. I'm going to move to questions for everybody now, and I'll come to Russell and Franco first on this one, but I'll give all of you an opportunity to answer. So there's two questions come in from Ignatius, and I think they are related. So Ignatius is asking, how can we basically, I think, mitigate against the risk that donor recipient countries are basically given technology that becomes very quickly out of date, or technology that they can't maintain or uphold. So he's asked that in two different ways. So, for example, wasted budgets on broken advanced solar PV that gets broken and left abandoned, for example. How should donors react and mitigate this issue in the near future? So his questions are around kind of how do you measure, I guess, whether the aid that's been given and what it's been spent on is actually working, in particular with some of the technologies that are being used. Russell, I'll come to you first on this one.
Sure. So yeah, I think there's two questions there. One is around sort of the technical assistance. So how do you measure the effectiveness of the technical assistance? And I think the other question was around, say, specifically around where technology has been provided as part of that support. And I think taking the first one first, I think two things here. Firstly, that's where it's really important to make sure, okay, is the technical assistance something that that the beneficiary has asked for? So it goes back to this being demand led. So it's really clear that the technical assistance you're providing, say, has been asked for by the beneficiary government. If it's the government, that means that stands more chance of the results of that technical assistance being taken up and used by the beneficiary government. And then there is then another thing you do. There is a way you can measure that. I know in the programs we've been managing, you know, we were asked to say, okay, you have an output, which is your technical assistance. Can you prove that there was an outcome? So can you prove that something happened as a result of that technical assistance? Obvious ones, the easy ones are, you know, if the technical assistance has been helping draft or provide some inputs into how some regulations should be written, and you can actually show that the regulations that you drafted were actually implemented by the beneficiary government, you can see that there's a clear, that technical assistance has clearly resulted in an outcome. So there are ways you can measure it. I mean, I think similarly in the technology one, I mean, this again comes down to, you know, in terms of you know, what are the requirements that are put alongside the delivery of that technology. So you would hope that you know, there was a procurement process for that solar PV, as for this example, you know, was robust. It was clear that there was a process by which, if the solar was broken and left abandoned, you know, there was a process by which that solar system could be removed, etc., and got rid of. And I think that is again one of the challenges of any of these donor programs is what happens after the program's finished. So, I mean, again, we don't know the details of this particular example, but if the solar PV system was installed 2 years into the program finished in 5 years, and this was 7 years later, again, how do you actually ensure that? And again, one of the things that we're being asked to think about very carefully is how do we ensure that there is some legacy of the program that we deliver? So how do you ensure that technical assistance in this case, or in another case, so some of the technologies that you're providing, it's clear what happens to them after the particular program has ended. So I think there are ways you can deal with both of those in the design of the programs.
Thanks, Russell. Franco, does this go back to the heart of what you were saying about data and the need for evidence and kind of evaluation?
Yes, I mean that's what we are really trying. We have put that as a challenge for us. I think it's a shared challenge. You know, let me say that I like when Catherine put the first slide. You have target direct action, means accelerated and scale, that, you know, you can apply roughly to the programs, and then you have the system change. So there is where a donor, I mean, and like an organization like ours, get the big challenges because you have to deal with two sets of issue. You know, how you scale up a project and how you are able to show systematic change. And it means that you have to build up in parallel a system that is not too expensive, because, you know, otherwise you will be anyway, open, as we were saying, is a scarce resource. So you cannot spend money to know, and then you don't have the money to do the thing. So and that's what we are trying to focusing. It is possible. You cannot do it alone. That's why, you know, the word partnership is important. We have been doing work with the IMF in looking at certain innovative indicators that allow us to have you know, much better decision and built up even in fragile countries what we call high frequency data. This is, you know, something that is going on, and we have Africa well in the picture. In other countries, like for instance in Asia, we are looking along the same line in areas that there is not much political tension, let's say, you know, even in Asia, issue linked to the AZ done by smoke in forest or pollution, you know, is something that affect everybody. So there are area where you can really push forward with these instruments. And going back to the question, yes, it is possible. We are at the moment, for instance, you know, something maybe that is not realized overall. We don't have an agreement internationally how to measure jobs. You know, how many jobs we create with our government. And, you know, if we go back to what Pradeep was saying, that we need more investment rather than aid. We would like to be able to measure some of the jobs that we create.
Yeah.
And that's the area where we are working in. We are working with ILO, so we are trying to have an harmonized work there. And these are the challenges. So I don't have something to offer straight away. The point is, I think we need an extra efforts at the level of, I would say, of cooperation, of partnership, to really bring up the idea that we need a bit more of effort in research oriented approach, because as you know, it's very easy to do the announcement at the beginning. We are going to put so much money over there. Then time goes, people who made the announcement are also goes, but then the one who comes, they have to tell you, what have you done with 300 billion, where you say, so that's what we are trying to raise the attention at different level in order to make sure that, this process is kept under the right radar.
Thanks, Franco. Catherine, you wanted to come in, and then I will move on actually to the very last round of questions, because I've just seen how fast the time has gone. Catherine, on this one in particular.
Yeah, I think this is a big one because it's, a new technology. What are our safe disposal standards? If we're going to help a country embrace new technologies, we also need to think about the whole life cycle of it. In the case of solar panels, we really want to be focusing and promoting recycling. And for us, and I also see that connection to our educational programs, our community programs, our youth programs. How can we give the community a sense of like, this is an investment in you, and what can you do to help maintain it or to dispose of it properly afterwards? So there's so much there that you can touch on from that systems perspective, so which is all important. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Pradeep and Nick, if you did want to comment on that, do so in your last round of questions, because I'm going to move on now to the very last two. And just to say before I do that, Langley, in terms of your request, we'll get back to you on that, and I will share your information, but I'm not promising anything, but I will pass on your contact details. So I think there are two things left, and to all of you, you can answer one or both of these, because one is just a comment. So one is from Ms. Mina, or Mr. Mina, who has said, we should support the biogas program at larger scale. Very passionate about this because it's in uppercase, all in uppercase. So if you have any comments on that, please feel free to make them. But the other question is from Francisco, who has said, in which topics do you think international standards are missing or required to support the development of climate action in developing countries? So any thoughts on international standards and if they would be helpful? So as I say, you can comment on Mina, but Francisco's question, this is the last round. So Nick, I'm going to come to you first. You're on mute still, Nick. Sorry, I think it hasn't unmuted.
Thanks. I'm conscious that we have our latest iteration of the UK's green finance strategy coming forward fairly shortly. So on the point about standards, we really do need to accelerate the work towards incentivizing every asset class and every business to fully understand its full supply chain and the sustainability of that, and the entire set of assets that investors are investing in. And so I think there's a lot of important work going on across the International Standards Board and many other bodies that are collecting this kind of data, and we really need to move that process forward. The financial system, the whole financial system globally, has only around a decade or less to become fully aligned with the sustainable investments. I think we've now reached that pivot point where it's not a question of, well, do we really have to? I think everybody now acknowledges they do, but we now need to accelerate the process of, so what does that look like, and what is the common standard, so that we're getting this right first time round. And then that bleeds into the entire sort of trade and investment agenda as we shift our trade and investment globally into more sustainable and net zero driving trade and investment, those standards come into play across food and products and so on. And we need a race to the top across all of that. And there's a very challenging trade environment at the moment for trying to achieve that. So I think those are two big areas of finance: the focus, the finance system, and the trading architecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I am conscious we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to ask you all to keep your comments as brief as possible before we wrap up. Pradeep, over to you.
No, I just want to come in and say that, there's a lot of work that's currently happening on sort of improving risk management and disclosure frameworks for organizations to report on nature-related risks. This is currently quite absent for all intents and purposes, but it goes beyond just standards. At the end of the day, we also see lessons from the voluntary carbon markets, where there are lots of issues on integrity and reversals and so on and so forth. So there's also an issue of, having standards is one thing, but then being able to track and ensure that we're actually heading in the right direction, and there aren't these kinds of, slippage or intentional, obfuscation of what is actually happening. I think these things are all related. And finally, just to say that, for many of these solutions, and this is really to Mina's point, everything's got a plus and a minus. Biogas works if it's done right. If it's not done right, it's actually quite damaging. So we got to get the details right. Sustainability of investments obviously becomes really important, not just the initial investment, but how do we maintain that over time, given that resources are going to be scarce and they're going to have multiple uses. So trade-offs will always be something we'll need to grapple with. Over.
Thanks, Pradeep. Russell, your final thoughts.
Yes, I think the thing I would say in relation to the standards issues, really about actually we need to see a bit more harmonization. I mean, you pick your topic, whether it's green bond issuance or climate disclosure. There is more than one standard that exists, and certainly in this region, the question we get asked most of all is, which standard should I use? Because there are differences between them. It's not clear which one they do. So I think, as well as say, there may be areas where there are need for more standards, but in some areas there is a need for harmonisation of standards to enable, so again, to make it a bit clearer for people, certainly who are just starting down this pathway, what it is they should do.
Thanks, Russell. Franco.
All right. Yep. But on standards, well, it's quite a challenge, because I was going through the list of action that we may put forwards, and it's really complex. We have in environmental governance. Just to give few examples, we have so many things where even in the case of the EU, we have a directive that will impact on standards, and we will have to do a company measure to make sure that these are understood in reality, that are not similar to ours, and we have issues to transparency, to traceability. So my point was more to highlight the issue of complexity, which is maybe banal, but in preparing this panel, I was looking at the COP 2015 that I think Nick, there is a list of targets and goals that to just monitoring that and, set up right system to follow if you're really achieving something or not is, so that's, I can only insist on the issue that look at the data, and make sure that we have some kind of governance around evidence, so we are not duplicating, and we are really trying to make sure that we have something transparent, that we can really give not just the idea, but certainty that there is a process where all this that we have promised is really moving towards this very, very important targets.
Thanks, Franco. Certainly got that message about complexity. And Catherine, we started with you, so I'm going to give you the final word on this one.
Thank you. I want to sign on to many of the comments here about the need to standardize and simplify where possible, so that we really can hold the private sector accountable to the targets that they have set, so that it's transparent, but also so that it's so that they have the support they need to do what are sometimes new and complex procedures. And also that we're working, not just developing countries, all of us, to really make sure we have this sustainable circular economy approach as we move into new technologies, that we're thinking about the whole cycle and that we aren't creating new problems for ourselves. So those would be two thoughts I would end with. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you to our audience for sending in so many and such wonderful questions. I think we managed to get through pretty much all of them. I would also like to echo what Francisco has just messaged in, which is thank you so much to the panel for the interesting answers and for the debate. So thank you so much to Catherine, to Pradeep, to Russell, to Nick, and to Franco for giving us so much of your time and your expertise. So many issues there that I think will be useful for the people in the audience, and also lots of food for thought as well for our audience. We are now sadly just out of time. If you have been watching this, to the audience, you should receive a questionnaire from us. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to answer that, it would be really helpful for us, because it means we continue to give you exactly the type of webinars that are useful for you, covering the topics that you want to hear about. We have other webinars coming up that you can see on our website. For example, there is a webinar on the 23rd of March, all about chain-based bonds. There, which if you are interested in that, you can sign up for that, but there are lots of other webinars as well available on our website. Thank you very much to EY being our knowledge partner today. We will be sending a link to everybody who registered for this webinar with the video from today, so they can watch that again and share it with their colleagues. We'll also be sending around a write-up of the conversation with the key issues that were raised today, so that can be shared as well with your networks. But I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Thanks again to our fantastic panel, and I hope to see you all again very soon at one of our webinars in the future. Thanks everybody, and goodbye. Bye.
Thank you.